Chapter. We're talking real money.
Where do you get your personal finance advice? Well, I know some of it comes from a podcast because you're listening to one now. Hi, I'm Tom Cock. Thanks for joining us on Talking Real Money. And today we're taking a little bit different tangent than we normally do. We're not taking your questions. No Don McDonald, giving him the day off. But you're going to see that this is a pretty interesting and I think enlightening topic because if you look back at the leadership of our country, how did the presidents do with their personal finances? So we're going to delve into that today with the author of an absolutely wonderful book. And if you're still looking for a summer read, this is the one, All the President's Money. The author is Megan Gorman, and she joins us here on Talking Real Money. Thank you for taking time to do this.
Oh, my goodness, Tom. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is a fascinating topic because everybody wants to know about everybody else's money, right? What they do with it, how they made it, how they keep it, all that kind of thing. But I got to ask you right up front, the question that occurs to me is there a correlation between leadership and effectiveness politically and personal finances? How do presidents do with their money? Is there a direct link between the people that have been great as president and they've been great with their money? Yay or nay on that one?
Yeah, you know what? I get asked this question all the time. And then I got to tell you, the hard part is the answer is it depends, right? So when we look at one of the presidents who was ranked one of the worst of all time, we go right to Warren G. Harding. And probably all you know about Warren G. Harding is the Teapot Dome scandal, that or the fact that he had a mistress in the White House. Those are the two things people think about when they come to him. But I'll tell you, he was phenomenal with money. He was an entrepreneur, right? And an entrepreneur back in the time when things like newspapers were their version of our AI. And so what you see with someone like a Warren G. Harding is he was able to take the appropriate risks, invest at the right time, hire the right people, and even think about growing his business in context of his employees. He had an ESOP for his newspaper.
Wow.
So, yeah, which, so for $300, he starts this newspaper. And by the time he dies in San Francisco in the suite at the Palace Hotel, he's in the middle of selling the newspaper. And he got the equivalent of what in today's dollars would be about $8 million. So he was phenomenal with money, bad as a president. But then we have other presidents who are really good with money and were good presidents, right? Ronald Reagan. But Ronald Reagan is one of those stories where he had a lot of struggle. Same thing with president like Abraham Lincoln. So what I would tell you is there's not really a correlation, but what I find is interesting is some of the presidents who failed or struggled when they were younger often did really well with money and then were really strong presidents.
Yeah, you mentioned, and we'll get to this in a little bit, grit as an important factor in all of this. It's not just straight line from one to the other. You got to deal with other things as they come along. And of course, people who become president know that. But okay, so that's great. And again, we'll talk about a few of the individual presidents that I enjoyed reading about. And that's what I love about the book. It's all these little stories about the presidents and their money. It's really great. But okay, but when you step back and look at all of them, what do you think the biggest lessons learned for folks listening to the podcast are from our elected top leaders about personal finance?
Yeah, don't laugh. It really depends on who you marry. And if you're really good, you marry up. George Washington, right? Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan. You think about these, Bill Clinton, you think about these presidents. But one of the things that a lot of them did is they married women who were from a higher economic class. And so that helped pull them up. But I think it gives you a better insight into something that's really important. And Tom, you probably know this as well, which is who you marry determines if you're going to have success with money. It's really important to have values that are sort of, aligned with each other. And, one of the interesting stories about Ronald Reagan, and it's in the book, but Ronald Reagan had a first wife, Jane Wyman, right? And I know a lot of young people probably is like, who's that? Like when I was growing up, she was Falcon Crest. But Jane Wyman in the 40s was a huge actress, right? She ends up winning the Oscar and she marries Ronald Reagan. And both Reagan and Jane came from poor backgrounds. But Ronald Reagan learned from his mother how to budget. And he was a phenomenal budgeter, right? Such an important skill. Jane Wyman came from no money, but when she started to make it as an actress, she loved to spend. And so these two get together and Jane, they get married and Jane even complains about it to the Hollywood magazines. Ronnie has a phobia about bills, right? Ronnie doesn't like us to be in debt, and Jane likes to spend and buy clothes. So these two have this sort of, they don't see eye to eye on money. And so I would tell you, going back to one of the most important skills, it's having those same values. And I'll tell you one last thing about Ronald Reagan. After he and Jane divorce, he finds a woman who has similar values to him, Nancy Reagan. And the two of them
good with a buck.
Good with a buck. She was willing to budget. She was willing to work within Ronnie's parameters. So again, values are really important.
I mean, unless you're married to Jeff Bezos, there is a budget, right? I mean, there's a limit for everybody.
This is
right,
true.
because you deal with this every day.
This is true. And I would say our current president and his wife have a lot of similar values. You know, we look at them and we're sort of curious about them, right? They're fascinating, like from the sidelines of how they operate. But one thing that Donald Trump and Melania Trump have in common is they both are very transactional in their mindset. And that might seem odd to others, but for them, that creates alignment with money. And that's probably why it worked. And I think if you go back to his first wife, Ivana Trump, she was also very transactional and entrepreneurial like him. So he does find women who have similar values to him.
Yeah. And so, but let's talk a little bit about that, about how presidents make money. I mean, are they great investors? Are they great with business? Are they great speculators? Or is it like Ronald Reagan? I still got the original $10 I made when I was running California, kept that in my pocket and didn't spend it. Where's the real wealth come from here?
It depends, right? So our first sort of group of presidents, and in particular the ones from Virginia, right? Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they all came from the plantation life, right? And they made money from their plantations and from slavery, which is horribly tragic. But, you know, as time goes on and the U.S. evolved, different opportunity sets really came into being. So two presidents that fascinate me are Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. Now, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln both grew up poor and both made their way up to have a lot of money. But one of the things that both of them did over the course of their life was speculate in land. Now, in Andrew Jackson's case, he gets incredibly burned on it very early on, and is very, very wary of some of the land speculation deals as time goes on. In comparison, Lincoln also gets burned by early deals that he gets in, but he learns how to loan money appropriately to help, other people and clip the interest payments. And so both Jackson and Lincoln really learn from their failures. And I think that's important. Other presidents who've done well have also inherited wealth. You can't, you look at Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, John Kennedy, the Bushes. But what's interesting about them is some of them have phenomenal skills. John Kennedy was incredibly frugal. He didn't like to spend money. He was worried that people were taking advantage of him. And people always say, oh, that seems odd. But I will tell you, I work with wealthy people in my practice. It's not an odd trait. And I think one of the challenges John Kennedy had is Jackie Kennedy wasn't as aligned on being so frugal. So I think the thing that you see again and again and again is that presidents were able to make money through various ventures. And I should mention, Richard Nixon failed at it, but he was an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because what did Nixon's failure with his quote unquote small business when he was trying to be in the frozen juice business that kind of messed up. And then, and I love your book because it doesn't just finish. He actually, I think if I remember correctly, didn't just do a bankrupt. They didn't do a bankruptcy. They went back and said they're going to pay everybody off, right? I mean, which in today's world would be very unusual. But what lesson did that teach him from a young age moving forward to when he did become president and how he dealt with money?
Yeah, first of all, Richard Nixon, he was a lawyer by training, and he set a practice in a small town of Whittier, California, where he knew everybody. And a couple guys there had this idea that they were going to put fresh orange juice on every table in America in the 1930s. Sounds sort of obvious to us, but it was a big deal in the 30s. And of course, they hired Nixon to set up the company, to do the friends and family round, and then to run the company, and it goes sideways. And one of the ways it goes sideways is, one, they were freezing the juice, not the concentrate, which is how Minute Maid ends up breaking through in the 40s. But Nixon also makes mistakes with the tax filings for Social Security and so on. And, I think for him, there was a sense of shame in letting down the local people of Whittier. And that's why he never wanted to let the company go into bankruptcy. He decided to assume the debt, and it took him years to pay it off. And when he was dating Pat, he didn't want her to know about the debt because it was sort of shameful. So I think for Nixon, he's a very complicated guy, as we know, very awkward man. But I think in his own way, he was trying to do the right thing for the people that got, injured by the business going under. And I think you see that. Now, he doesn't take any great risks afterwards. He becomes a lawyer after the vice presidency. He basically goes to more of a tried or true approach. But I always wonder, most entrepreneurs fail once or twice before they succeed. If he had tried again, he might have been successful in an entrepreneur type endeavor.
And that's fascinating that in business, he didn't want to let people down. He certainly did politically 40 years later when he was forced to resign the presidency. The book is All the President's Money. We're talking with Megan Gorman, who is the author of it. As I said at the beginning, it's a wonderful read. It's fun. It's interesting. I think there's some great lessons to be learned there. Among them, you point out a few of these, and I'd like to talk about a few of the sort of the traits, if you will. You said Eisenhower was really good because he could control one's emotion. Now, you and I know as people as people in the business of helping others with their money, if you can do that, you're way ahead of the game, right? I mean, and that's a great example of really how to be successful.
Yeah. I mean, Eisenhower, look, there's a reason why D-Day succeeded, right? And he was so successful in what he did over the course of his life. But he learned to be very much in control of his emotion. And one of the things I found in my research is as a young boy, he was not close with his father. There was a lot of friction there. He was in a large family, a poor family in Kansas. But there was somebody in town, a man in town, who would take young Eisenhower out fishing, hunting, and they'd be out there. And he started to teach him how to play poker very early on and all the keys of poker, right? And what you find often is good poker players are often good at controlling their emotions. And so Eisenhower learned this very early on. And of course, as time goes on, he's able to parlay this skill into helping him build wealth, especially in a job where he was in the Army, where he wasn't making a lot. Now, I talked to you about how people married up. Eisenhower's a good example of this. When Eisenhower met Mamie, and if you ever get a chance, Google a picture of the two of them. They were both really good looking when they were young. He falls in love with her, but she's wealthy. And her father is very worried about Eisenhower marrying his daughter. And, one of the things that ends up happening is Eisenhower gets an allowance from his father-in-law for the first part of their marriage. But Eisenhower used his poker skills to buy Mamie's engagement ring. And it was a cute story I found in one of the Eisenhower family memoirs, just because I think it was something the family always shared and didn't really put out there much. But he did buy Mamie an expensive ring, and to make the money to pay it off, he played poker against his Army buddies and won.
Wow, he took it from other guys in the armed forces that probably couldn't afford it either. But okay, but you already mentioned Reagan and the master of budgeting, which I think is great. But Gerald Ford, I mean, all the 20th century presidents, and we could talk more about this, but Gerald Ford, according to your book, and I think this is accurate, is the first one that really looked at being the celebrity president in a way, right? The guy who could, after serving in office, could go out and endorse products. He could give speeches and write a book and sort of turn this into a profit center that I don't think others really thought. Although Nixon, of course, wrote his memoirs, and I think probably got well paid for all that. But you mentioned Ford as the master of the pivot. Yes. And what you're talking about is moving from politics into celebrity to make a living, correct?
Right. And when he started to fail, he was able to pivot out of it quickly. So, it's interesting. Before Ford, presidents either died, practiced law, or wrote a book. So Nixon's track was the same thing that Truman and Eisenhower had both done. But Ford looked at it a little differently because he was like 60, 61 when he retired. He left the office of presidency. And he was like, I'm young. Like, I want to do stuff. So, of course, he and Betty signs the book deal, right? And that's a big deal. First joint book deal for a president and first lady. I think they got $1 million for it. But the other thing that Ford does is he goes out there and he takes on different things. One of the things he does is he endorses medals by the Franklin Mint. Now, today we know that as a kitschy company, but in the 70s, particularly around the bicentennial, the Franklin Mint was a serious business, publicly traded stock, and people thought if they bought these medals that they would appreciate in value. So Ford goes and he puts out a medal set of like 40 different parts of the presidency, different presidents doing important things. And of course, he's attacked by the papers. And they're like, who is this guy being so tacky? If Nixon hadn't screwed up, he would have just been some forgotten congressman. And
accidental president. Yeah,
accidental president, right? So he, of course, pivots away from this and does something else. He goes on corporate boards. And by all accounts, he was phenomenal on corporate boards because he saw the world differently. Now, other presidents have evolved that. Bill Clinton in his speaking career. You've got The Obamas with their production company. Joe Biden's book just got sold. And of course, the big part that people talked about, it didn't sell for like the Obamas or the Bushes or the Clintons' books. Kamala Harris just had a book come out today, or it's about to come out. And so again, Ford is the one who made this acceptable for people to make money post-presidency. And I think, Tom, one of the things that's really important here, I think as a country that we need to eventually talk about is when people are president, should they be allowed to engage in endeavors? Because in the times of Lincoln or even the times of LBJ, people weren't brands. They weren't influencers. Today, you get to run for president and then you get basically a blank check to do what you want. And so I think one of the struggles people have today is what to do when somebody's president. Does money sit in a blind trust? Who runs the blind trust? How are you not influencing things? And so you saw presidents like LBJ, Carter, Obama struggle with having these blind trusts. And I'm not surprised. And we really don't have a good, efficient system in this country to manage that.
Yeah, we don't. Well, we can't even get something through Congress, which I think is easy, and that is not allowing members of Congress to buy and sell stock while they're in. Anyway, I can't believe that's controversial. But we've talked. I mean, what's your opinion on that? I mean, I don't think they should be. If you're in Congress, you should be buying and selling securities of which you probably have information that I don't have about them.
Correct. I think we should treat them like publicly traded CEOs, right? Who aren't able to sell, who have to buy and hold their stock and not do any transactions on anything that they would have material, non-public information. And, I think that we have to remember people who go to Congress, when they get out now, they become pundits, right? They write books. They get big, consulting gigs with, companies and consulting firms. So they actually have benefited from the Jerry Ford rule. So I think Americans don't trust politicians, right? And when it comes to money and politicians, they really don't trust. I think it would be really effective if people were able, if when people go to Congress or they become the president, they walk away from their holdings and don't try to profit on it, knowing that the Jerry Ford rule exists and they will likely maximize it when they get out.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But you raised Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton is not in your book, I don't believe, or is he? I don't remember reading much about a little bit, but it's an interesting case in terms of 20th century because the Clintons, as I can remember them, because I'm old enough to remember when they were in office, or Bill Clinton, basically said, and I may be paraphrasing a bit, look, we've taken on this oath of public service. It's about helping others, et cetera. It's not about the money. We could have done things to make money, but we didn't. And now if you look today, I think they're worth like $250 million. It's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So it raises this question, I think, around, because the book is about personal finance, how people made money or didn't make money. I mean, do people that retire from the presidency, did they even need to worry about money anymore? Because it just seems like it's going to float in the door in various ways.
Well, first of all, if you look at the Clintons back in the 70s, they were two very smart people who were not good with money. And in the book, I talk about it. But if you look at Whitewater, and you look at what that original transaction is, it was a guy they knew who said, come invest in this land with us. And, Tom, when you and I have clients and we're talking to them about money, what do they do? What do? We do due diligence. We ask questions. But I think sometimes people who are not experienced with money don't realize it's not the answers to the questions that matter. It matters that you ask the questions. Because, again, it'll give you a good gut feeling. So the Clintons, didn't do great with money before the presidency. And obviously in the presidency, there was a ton of legal bills. And when they got out, Bill Clinton decided he was going to make money on speeches. Bill Clinton, by all accounts, has this charisma that people talk about when you're with him. Even people who don't like him are like, there's just something about him. And Clinton went all over the globe raising money with speeches. And so what's interesting is when Hillary Clinton, of course, when she was senator and then when she ran for president and when she was Secretary of State, when you look at her disclosures, their portfolio was a lot of index funds, which I understood, right? I felt like, okay, they did make a lot of money, but when you go into what they had, they were, doing indexing. You also see in their finances things like an irrevocable life insurance trust, which made sense based on where the estate tax was at that period of time. So I think they started to learn as time went on. And I liked the fact that in their finances, you don't see the conflict that you were expecting to see.
Yeah, let's take up a couple, because we just have a little bit of time left here, a couple of presidents and one other point that I mentioned earlier that you mentioned a couple of times, I think, in the book, and that is grit. I mean, if you're going to be president, you got to tough it out because you're going to take a lot of abuse. You got to go through a lot of elections. But investors, do people that trying to make money in markets, that kind of thing, do you think that grit is an important part of your makeup to be successful as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people who are really successful with money and investing know that some of it is self-generated, right? Where they go out and they work really hard and then they make money from it and then put that money to work, right? And the person who always comes to mind when I think of grit is Herbert Hoover, right? And Herbert Hoover, not a great president, but actually a fabulous human being, incredibly charitable, but he came from nothing. He was an orphan and he was a Quaker. And the Quakers taught him, because he had a guardian, but he had a financial guardian. And the financial guardian he'd have to submit budgets to. And so Herbert Hoover, over the course of his early life, learns to budget, learns financial skills, and then goes as far when he can't get a job after Stanford, which in the first class at Stanford, there was no tuition. He was lucky to get in. He goes to the Sierra Nevadas and goes into the mines and learns mining. And then he takes his budgeting and his mining skills and he goes to Australia. And ultimately, he discovers a gold mine. I get into it in the book. But he's always a hard worker. And when he's able to make money, he's saving it, he's staying on budget, and then he's also helping others. And I think that having a philosophy when you're building wealth is really important. I think Herbert Hoover would have told you that was his philosophy. In quick comparison, Woodrow Wilson, he was always, he's very much an academic, and he was very holier than thou about money. And when he graduates law school, he moves to Atlanta, which is booming at that time. You plant a penny in the street and you grow a money tree. He starts his own law firm. And, rather than going to an experienced firm where he'd have to work for someone else, it's him and a buddy. And they sit around reading poetry all day. And they don't really work that hard. And they hate having to go gather fees. And they don't work hard in the sense of you got to hustle. And I think that's part of the American sort of spirit about building wealth is that hustle aspect of I'm going to work real hard. And one of the things a lot of my clients who read the book said to me was I never thought about all the other traits because I just thought I was fortunate to make money because I worked hard and I was lucky.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. So before we let you get away, and by the way, the book is fabulous. This is a wonderful read for anybody interested in investing, and I love the political aspect. The stories are just fascinating about all the presidents, so well done on all that. But what do you believe? The book's been out for a while. It's certainly available at Amazon and other places still. But what do you believe is the biggest takeaway for investors today that read the book? What's the one thing they're going to say, that's the aha moment that I hadn't really thought of prior to this?
Yeah, so I think the thing that was surprising to me and my aha, and I think other people feel it, is finances today are the same as they were in George Washington's time, right? It's all the same financial issues, being stressed about money, trying to succeed, trying to send your kids to college, right? All of those same issues. However, what's really unique today, and in a bad way, is it's harder than ever to achieve the American dream. So people aren't crazy when they're saying it's hard. It really is. And it's always been hard, but this is a whole new, different type of difficulty in achieving the dream. So the dream is still there. I think we have to figure out ways to get more Americans to be able to achieve that dream.
Yeah, even though today, I just read this yesterday, we're minting 1,000 new millionaires every day. Globally. I mean, which is a lot of people, but you're right. Then at the bottom, it's a whole different topic.
Yeah, what we've seen
lovely book
is that split between high earners and low earners.
Exactly. Yeah, no, we totally agree there. Again, the book is All the President's Money. The author is Megan Gorman. I highly recommend it, and we thank you very much for being part of the program today.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
It's good stuff, and we'll have more of that as we always are here every single day, talking real money.
The opinions and views expressed on this podcast were current on the date recorded. Opinions, estimates, forecasts, and statements of financial market trends that are based on current market conditions constitute our judgment and are subject to change without notice, including any forward-looking estimates or statements which are based on certain expectations and assumptions. Although information and opinions given have been obtained from or based on sources believed to be reliable, no warranty or representation is made as to their correctness, completeness, or accuracy. Information presented on the podcast is not personalized investment advice from Appellate Wealth. The views and strategies described may not be suitable for everyone. This podcast does not identify all the risks, direct or indirect, or other considerations which might be material to you when entering any financial transaction. Past performance does not guarantee future results, and profitable results cannot be guaranteed. We hope you realize that the information provided on Talking Real Money is for informational, educational, and hopefully enjoyable purposes only. The podcast is not trying to get you to buy or sell any financial products or securities. Instead, the program is provided as a public service by Apella Wealth, a fee-only registered investment advisor. Please see Apella Wealth's ADV Part 2A on our website for information regarding Apella's fees and services. Apella Capital, LLC, DBA Apella Wealth, is an investment advisory firm registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The firm only transacts business in the states where it is properly registered or excluded or exempt from registration requirements. Registration with the SEC or any state securities authority does not imply a certain level of skill or training. Apella does not provide tax or legal advice, and nothing either stated or implied here should be inferred as providing such advice. Thanks for listening, and please visit TalkingRealMoney.com for more information and important disclosure related to performance of any specific index or fund quoted in this podcast. And the lawyers get richer.